Welcome back to Talk Africa. Now, to add more insight into how Africa can transform its agricultural sector, I have expert guests standing by in Johannesburg. Michael Sudekasa is the CEO at Africa Business Group in Nairobi. Dr. James Okenno is the Products Stewardship Manager at the African Agricultural Technology Foundation. And with me in studio is Dr. Richard Monang. He's the Africa Regional Climate Change Coordinator at UNEP here in Nairobi. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. Michael Sudekasa in Johannesburg, let's start off with you. And the situation generally in southern African countries. As many as 49 million people are said to be facing a severe drought, the worst in 35 years. As an example of what's going on in Africa, what is the fate now of Africa's agriculture?
Well, you started off with one of the big challenges of the continent, which is the impact of climate change and El Nino. And I think that we really have to guard how we move forward in the agricultural sector in terms of what we can do to mitigate that impact. Our topic about transformation is critical because one of the challenges that we have on the continent is that we don't utilize mechanization, we don't utilize technology, we don't utilize storage adequately. And so we are really at the whims of Mother Nature. We don't utilize irrigation, which really could change a lot on the continent. So the state of agriculture on the continent basically is on the uprise, but we have to really start paying more attention to how we address climate change and its impact. And I think our focus today on transformation is really the direction that we need to go in. We need climate resilient seeds. I mentioned we need irrigation and we need storage.
Dr. Monang, we are at the mercy of Mother Nature, and the United Nations itself predicts that by 2030 droughts will leave the continent at least with 40% less arable land. With what we know now in terms of climate change, what are we doing about it?
Thank you very much, Beatrice, for having me in studio. I think the point of what we are doing about it from the African perspective today is quite very crucial because agricultural transformation in the continent cannot be considered in isolation with the climate stressors which are already impacting the continent through the El Ninos in southern Africa and eastern Africa, as we see. However, in moving forward with the different actions that are taking place, this cannot be considered in isolation of climate change and also ecological degradation. The African gap report, which was produced by UNEP last year, shows that agricultural production will decrease by up to about 40%. And at the same time today, the continent is losing $68 billion yearly as a result of land degradation. So moving forward with the changing climate and at the same time with the ecological degradation, which is costing $68 billion, it is therefore imperative to ensure that any action that is being put in place to ensure agricultural transformation should take into consideration nature approaches that is working with nature and not against nature.
Right. Dr. Okenno, what are we getting right on the continent? What aren't we getting right in terms of our agricultural processes?
So, Beatrice, this is what I have to say. African agriculture is facing a lot of challenges. And one of them has been mentioned, that is the Mother Nature, the effect of drought, floods, and so on. But I also want to say, Beatrice, that African agriculture has to come back to the development agenda by our able leaders, bring it to the development agenda. Now, to do this, African agriculture has to adopt prevailing new technologies that have been developed. The African farms are known for producing less per unit area, that is the yield, meaning we have inferior crop types, or which we call in science hybrids or varieties. Now, to adopt technology, technologies is coming in many forms. One of them is the use of the hybrids as a crop type instead of what we call the land races that our parents or forefathers were using. So we start putting more money in research and development to develop new crop types. Now we also have
Right.
other factors that really pull down our or depress our yields.
We will come back to
the
the whole issue, Dr. Okenno. We'll come back with that issue of what is depressing our yields. But for now, I just want to come back to you, Michael Sudekasa, because there are varied points in this discussion here. One of them, you've talked about transforming Africa's agriculture, and Dr. Okenno has talked about low yields. How do we transform Africa's agriculture?
Well, I mentioned that we are at a point where increasing numbers of stakeholders on the continent and our partners off the continent are focused on how we can add value to our crops, how we can make sure our crops are more resilient. I mentioned the utilization of mechanization, the utilization of irrigation, using better seeds, which my colleague started talking about as well. These are all ways that we're transforming agriculture. We used to use the hoe, and we're moving away from farming with the hoe. The theme is to banish the hoe to the museum, and so that we can also bring in young people to transform agriculture. The average age of a farmer on the continent now is upwards of 55 years. To feed our continent for the next 50 years and beyond, we're going to have younger farmers. And so part of the whole idea of transforming agriculture includes also having younger stakeholders. We have urban farming,
right,
people farming in containers, so that you can, basically make sure that you can protect against Mother Nature, as I mentioned. So how do we use hydroponics and how do we use greenhouses? These are all areas that are starting to become more prevalent on the continent, which help us transform agriculture.
Dr. Manang, of course, experts will continue pointing a finger at climate change as one of the reasons that Africa faces such a huge food deficit. Are there viable options here now for the continent?
Absolutely, so many viable options. If you look at the continent today, it actually contains 65% of uncultivated arable land. And if you look at the unemployed youth, as Michael mentioned, there are about 200 million youths, and with 60% of them unemployed today. But if you look at how the jobs will be created, the continent is providing a lot of opportunities, and if you dovetail this within the African Union Agenda 2063 and also the Sustainable Development Goals, as well as the post-Paris Agreement on climate change, which provides an opportunity to be able to tap into renewable energy, into sun, into wind, into solar. All these could actually be used not only to expand the entire agro value chain, but at the same time also to set up what we call agro-industrialization in rural areas, where 80% of the food that we depend on in the continent today is produced by smallholder farmers, and most of them women. So decentralizing renewable energy so that agro-industrialization could be set up in rural areas today will not only help to create jobs for the youth, but at the same time also help spur ingenuity and economic opportunities, which will help the continent to be able to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, as well as also their climate mitigation options, which they actually give these in the form of what is called intended national determined contributions.
And I come back to that whole question of seed management there, Dr. Okenno, because we've heard that 80% of the food produced is produced in the rural areas where, land is probably 1 hectare or less. How do you grow your food, though, first to feed the population and also for economic growth, enough for economic growth?
Yes, Beatrice, what we need to do is to make that land, irrespective of its size, to produce its potential. Now, to produce its potential, I started by saying, let's give it the right crop type. That's one way of looking at it. So we're still going to have production or productivity per unit area. So irrespective of whether it is just 1 hectare or half an hectare or a quarter an hectare, we have to produce to its potential. The other thing we have to look at in terms of climate change is to adopt or look at agriculture holistically. Adopt the smart agriculture in terms of in this way. So you have the right variety. The other thing we need to have, actually, Africa is described as having less water sources, so the dams and rivers. Then we need to really store any little water that we have that's available, and also use it efficiently. So we could also adopt technologies like drip irrigation, even at the small scale land holding system. This is possible. This works out. The other thing that I want to conclude on that, conclude that topic on is African agriculture is highly diversified. Whereas we talk of green revolution in the 60s in Southeast Asia and Latin America, they were only dealing with the two types of crops, that is rice and wheat. Very easy for scientists to adopt, to breed and improve on them easily. When you come to Africa, you are talking of many crops, and these have to be done right at whatever land size.
Well, I'll come back though to Michael Sudekasa there, because Dr. Okenna, you've mentioned a point about investing in our agriculture there. Michael, you're a proponent of investing in agriculture. What kind of investments are we talking about here that can transform that agricultural sector?
Well, I keep coming back to the area of infrastructure as a key one that we need. I appreciate the comment from Dr. Manang about investing or developing our renewable energy capacity to create agro-industrial zones in rural areas. I mean, this is an initiative that countries like Nigeria, countries like the DRC are taking very seriously. We have to also, as I mentioned earlier, store our food. We lose something like 40 to 50% of our food to post-harvest losses because there's no place in the hot sun to store. We don't have adequate cold chain. We don't have adequate silos. So for me, a lot of that should be in the infrastructure space. The other area that is ripe for investment is also in the input space. So we talk about fertilizer, we talk about better seeds, we talk about utilizing agrochemicals. That's a key area. And then lastly, skills. We really need to improve the capacity of our young people. ICT is becoming a greater part of the agricultural and agribusiness development paradigm. And so we need farmers and we need people in the value chain who understand how to use technology. So those three areas are critical areas for me in terms of investment.
Right. Dr. Munangdo, if all these views are put together, do you think Africa can feed itself? Africa is still importing about $35 billion worth of food every year.
Absolutely. Africa could feed itself and the entire world. And if you look at the different solutions that are happening across Africa today, it is not the absence of ideas, it's not the absence of innovation. What has actually been lacking in the continent has been a lack of an implementation platform that is inclusive, that bring all stakeholders together, the private sector, the civil society, the NGOs, the policymakers, the youth, and even individual citizens. And so having an inclusive implementation framework that brings the bits and pieces and ensure that investment can actually be channeled into the right areas within the entire agro value chain could actually work. And in July 2015, the UN Environment Programme, in collaboration with partners across the continent, created what is called the Ecosystem-Based Adaptation for Food Security Assembly, whereby each country is domesticating this at the national level and ensuring that every stakeholder is brought together. Because if you look at the entire agro-value chain, on-farm production, you have farmers, but in the middle, you also need the private sector to come in with technologies through ICTs, through renewable energy. And you also need policymakers to be able to incentivize and create an enabling environment for the private sector to be able to help these farmers. And then you need markets, you need roads, and you need all this happening under a changing climate, but in a way that are not adding to the emissions. So alternatively, with what we have today, Africa could actually feed the world. But there is a last point, which is about financing. The continent doesn't lack the resources. The continent is losing about $60 billion every year as a result of illicit financial flows. And also the continent is benefiting from diaspora financing, which every year diaspora remittances, which in 2016 it is estimated that 42 billion will actually come into the continent as a result of these remittances. So what needs to be done is that the private sector, especially commercial banks, should look into those who are receiving these remittances, and most of them smallholder farmers. Can they be able, based on the amount of money they are receiving, then be given some loans that are tapped into the agricultural sector, especially those who are utilizing agricultural approaches that are working with nature and not destroying the environment, giving loans at low interest rate. And lastly, there is what is called the risk-sharing facility, which is quite very instrumental in actually spurring lending in agricultural sector, and Nigeria has actually piloted this, developing a risk sharing facility in the agricultural sector, which if it is integrated with other risk reducing approaches like the ecosystem-based adaptation could actually reach out to so many millions of farmers. So Africa have the tools and actually the opportunities to feed itself and the world.
Dr. Monang, we'll have to leave it there for the moment, and that's all we have time for this week. But thank you to my guests for their insights. In Johannesburg, Michael Tudakasa, he's the CEO at Africa Business Group. In Nairobi, Dr. James Okeno, he's a product stewardship manager at the African Agricultural Technology Foundation. And with me here in studio is Dr. Richard Monang. He's the Africa Regional Climate Change Coordinator at UNEP here in Nairobi. Thank you very much for your insights. And remember, you can join the conversation online through Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. And to join us again next week for another edition of Talk Africa. Goodbye.